Categorization and concept formation. Background. Children sort blocks into different piles, birds cache food in different locations, and ants attack ants from different nests. All of these examples show how organisms attempt to organize stimuli and events in their environment. The tendency of humans to systematically arrange their natural world can be traced back to the ancient Greeks, evidenced by Aristotle's biological classification systems. This basic schematic was revised and redrawn over the centuries as scientists and amateurs grouped both plants and animals according to different sets of rules. This often resulted in large catalog-like descriptions that were completely unworkable, particularly as an increasing number of specimens were brought back to Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries, in the 1600s and 1700s from Asia, Africa, and the Americas. The classification process was revolutionized by Carl von Linné, a Swedish naturalist who is better known by the Latinized form of his name, Carolus Linnaeus. In 1735, Linnaeus published his first edition of Systema Naturae, which categorized the hundreds of plants and animals that he and his students had identified. The 10th and final version of this work, 1758, described more than 4,000 animals and 7,000 plant species. Linnaeus's taxonomy was neither complete nor flawless, but his contribution to modern science was enormous. Although others had used the binomial system of species names, Linnaeus was the first to do so consistently. This allowed scientists to communicate about the species they were studying and facilitated the development of many disciplines, most notably zoology and botany. Another of Linnaeus's innovations was to categorize plants and animals based on similarities rather than differences, creating a hierarchical arrangement of species that is a template for contemporary schematics. For example, even though he was writing 100 years before Darwin and believed that species were fixed entities created by God, Linnaeus produced the first draft of an evolutionary tree pointing to genetic relatedness. As historians have noted, one of the most impressive things about Linnaeus was his willingness to change his mind when new information reached him. This led to a constant revising of his classification system, such that some animals, including his own pet raccoon, were moved repeatedly from one genus or species to another. Linnaeus's taxonomy underwent major modification with the rise of evolutionary theory and the emphasis on grouping organisms based on common descent. The entire process was revolutionized in the 20th century and the 1900s, when it became possible to sequence the DNA of living and sometimes extinct species. Using this evidence, chimps replaced gorillas as the closest living relative of humans. Despite these advances, conflicts arose when similarities in observable traits did not match genetic or evolutionary data. Nonetheless, the validity of Linnaeus's original premise remains. Groups of animals at both the top and bottom of the taxonomic hierarchy share similar traits. Chapter Plan. Besides the obvious connection to comparative research, Linnaeus's classification system is profiled in the opening of this chapter because his system of taxonomy reflects the cognitive processes of categorization and concept formation. In its simplest form, categorization groups similar things together, such as different animals that look the same. The chapter opens with a brief description of important terms and experimental paradigms in categorization research, and then highlights the evolutionary significance of this cognitive process. The bulk of the chapter is devoted to describing 4 types of categorization: perceptual, functional, relational, and social. Grouping items together using one of these processes allows newly encountered stimuli to be placed within an existing framework, an important outcome of Linnaeus's work. As with biological taxonomy, categorization is an ongoing process. If new items do not fit into one category or another, individuals may redefine how the categories are, just as scientists continually modify the criteria that define a particular species. This chapter attempts to explain how this cognitive process operates, highlighting both similarities and differences across species. One of the greatest appeals of Linnaeus's classification system is that other individuals, both scientists and non-scientists, can immediately grasp information about an organism, even one that is completely unfamiliar to them. Knowing that a particular animal is a mammal allows one to infer that it has hair, mammary glands, and 3 rather than 1 inner ear bones. This ability to extrapolate unobserved or even unobservable characteristics of novel stimuli is discussed under the topic of concept formation. 3 prominent theories of concept formation, elemental, exemplar, and prototype, are then used to explain different aspects of perceptual, relational, functional, and social categorization. The chapter concludes with a description of category-specific semantic deficits, a human condition produced by brain damage or atrophy of particular regions of the cerebral cortex. The relationship between cognitive impairments and affected neural regions in this disorder provides insight into brain mechanisms that mediate both categorization and concept formation. Fundamentals. Researchers from many different disciplines examine how and why organisms systematically arrange the world around them. As with any scientific endeavor, the work is facilitated by a common terminology and agreement on how to measure these cognitive processes. Although debates are ongoing, research in this area has helped scientists to formulate both proximate and ultimate explanations for categorization and concept formation. Definitions. Categorization is the cognitive process of classifying items or events into groups based on one or more common features. The converse, discrimination, is distinguishing items or events based on one or more distinct features. A critical aspect of categorization is that items within a category must be distinguishable, even though they share common features. In other words, a category is not a collection of identical elements, but a group of separate units that are held together by common characteristics. For example, stimuli that fall into the category circle may come in an infinite number of colors and sizes, whereas a collection of circles that are exact replicas of each other would not constitute a category. The ability to categorize is intimately linked to concepts, the abstract set of rules that define membership in a category, or the mental criteria which allow stimuli, events, or even ideas to be grouped together. Categories and the concepts that define them often change with experience. This experience may involve direct interaction with the items that make up a category and/or increased knowledge of the criteria that define group membership. Consider how children learn to divide animals into pets, farm animals, and wildlife. They may draw on their own experience in different situations, e.g., visiting a farm or zoo, use information acquired from picture books or TV, or rely on adult explanations of where these animals live. At a later age, most children learn the list of criteria that define the subgroup mammals. The subsequent ability to categorize animals as mammals or non-mammals depends on knowledge of mammalian characteristics, e.g. mammary glands and hair on body, acquired through specific instruction. These very different means of learning new information allow children to refine their understanding of animals and how they may be subdivided into separate groups. This cognitive process of establishing and updating the abstract set of rules for category membership is referred to as concept formation. Importantly, categorization may occur in the absence of concept formation. This may sound counterintuitive. However, the ability to group similar items together is not the same thing as understanding the criteria, both necessary and sufficient, that define that group. Forming a concept of a particular category allows an individual to infer properties about items in that category which may or may not be apparent on initial exposure. For example, on any given day, most people encounter a number of new objects that resemble large steel boxes with wheels. With only brief visual exposure to the exterior, These items are categorized as cars. Immediately, an assumption is made that each object has a steering device, an internal mechanism that requires an energy source, and that it is used to travel from one place to another. It is not necessary to see the interior or to view the object moving to make these attributions. In some cases, the categorization may be incorrect. The characteristics that define a category may be vague or require further refining. Perhaps the object is a minivan and not a car. The concept of cars would have to be modified accordingly, e.g., does not include larger multi-seat vehicles with hatchback openings. An important distinction between categories and concepts, therefore, is that concepts involve mental representations of group attributes that do not depend on immediate interactions with the environment. Measuring categorization. Assessing categorization in humans can be as simple as asking them to sort playing cards according to some rule, e.g. suit or face value, or to press the spacebar on a computer when presented with a specific class of stimuli, e.g. low versus high tones. The same principle is applied to animal experiments in which subjects display categorization by responding in the same way to items within a category. Numerous examples of this experimental design were presented in previous chapters, such as blue jays pecking an image on a computer screen when they saw a moth. Chapter 2 shows an auditory version of the setup in which a zebra finch is waiting for the next stimulus presentation. The bird will indicate how it categorizes recorded conspecific song notes by flying or not to a perch located at the opposite end of the enclosure. These go, no-go experiments allow animals to respond yes or no to the question, does this stimulus belong in category X? The task may be modified by training animals to make different responses for each category. Fly to the left perch if the stimulus belongs in category X, and to the right one if it belongs in category Y. Figure 9.1, Experimental Design A and Results B from an auditory discrimination task in zebra finches. A. Birds were trained to wait on a perch until a zebra finch call note was presented through a speaker. Notes were classified as A, B, C, or D according to acoustic properties. Each bird was trained to fly to a perch at the other end of the enclosure when it heard notes from one category, but not the others. B. Over trials, birds correctly classified notes in each category, responding only to those notes within the assigned category. Okay, so you can see that the zebra finch is in a box, so they have a button they can press, and they can fly to one of two perches, and a light will turn on. Okay, so there's 4 line graphs, and the y-axis is percentage of responses from 0 to 80%, and the x-axis is 1,000 trial blocks from 0 to 20. Okay, so in the first one, you can see the A note type group. The percentage of response is the highest for the A note type. Well, that makes sense. And then same for the B note type, same for the C note type, and same for the D note type. So they're responding to the specific note correctly. Okay, only that note. So they're able to distinguish notes. That's so interesting. Laboratory experiments such as these help researchers to understand how animals are categorizing stimuli. Frequently, a novel exemplar, a distinct item within a category, is presented in a small subset of trials. This manipulation tests whether animals are classifying stimuli based on common features or simply memorizing each item in a category. In Figure 9.1, zebra finches correctly classified notes that they had never heard, suggesting that they were able to identify similarities between novel and familiar exemplars. Carefully controlled experiments may also distinguish cognitive mechanisms based on item classification from those based on broad discrimination of a category boundary. For example, Polynesian field crickets respond differently to auditory stimuli that are above or below a frequency of 16 kHz, but the experiment did not test whether these animals could differentiate tones within each group. Thus, it is not clear whether crickets were classifying sounds based on similarities, i.e. categorization, or dividing stimuli into two large and amorphous groups using a single threshold value. More tightly controlled experiments revealed categorization abilities in other insects. Honeybees, ants, and wasps categorize visual stimuli, including novel exemplars, using specific features such as color, pattern, or motion contrast. Another experimental method for assessing categorization is to test whether items within a class can be substituted for each other. The assumption behind the test is as follows. If items within a category elicit the same response, altering the response to one exemplar should shift responding to all others within the category. Children who are bitten by a dog are likely to exhibit fear responses to other, perhaps all dogs, not just the one that bit them. This shows that they have a mental representation of the category dog that includes distinct items within the group. Many animals pass both the novel exemplar and stimulus substitution tests of categorization, but whether this provides evidence for concept formation is much more difficult to establish. Evolutionary significance. Despite debates on concept formation, most researchers acknowledge that almost every species tested displays some level of categorization. Even young infants possess this cognitive ability. The fact that categorization is pervasive in the animal kingdom suggests that it has some adaptive value. The most plausible is that mental resources are reduced if organisms can group stimuli or events together that require the same response. As for the cricket, a simple rubric that divides auditory stimuli into two classes makes it much easier to decide whether to approach or retreat from a sound. A further advantage of categorization is that updating cognitive representations of one item will be transferred to other items in the same category. This allows organisms to use experience acquired in one situation to modify behavior in related ones, generalizability. Because two stimuli or events will never be identical, if nothing else, the time at which they occur is different, categorization provides a framework for interpreting new experiences. Animals that live in cities often find food scraps in the garbage, allowing them to classify garbage and refuse bins as good food sources. Some theorists go so far as to state that memory, without categorization, is useless. Not everyone agrees with this extreme statement, but there is little doubt that an ability to remember specific details, but an inability to extract generalities from these details, is disadvantageous. See Box 9.1. Box 9.1, a downside to details. Some people have an amazing capacity to remember almost every detail of past events and are often surprised to learn that other people do not share this ability. One of the best known is Solomon Shuroshevsky, 1886 to 1958, a Russian journalist who was studied for over 30 years by the neurologist Luria. Shuroshevsky ended up in Luria's office quite by accident. His boss was annoyed that he never took notes during meetings and confronted Shuroshevsky by suggesting that he was not fulfilling his work obligations. Shuroshevsky confided that he was baffled by his colleague's need to keep written records and revealed that he could recount every detail of his editor's conversations from previous meetings. Fortunately, his boss recognized these cognitive abilities as unique and exceptional, so he referred Shuroshevsky to Professor Luria. Luria documented Shuroshevsky's aptitude for remembering details, including the fact that he could recite, both backwards and forwards, a string of numbers, close to 100 digits long, more than 15 years after he originally heard it. It goes without saying that he could memorize long lists of words, entire texts in foreign languages, and complex mathematical equations. Amazingly, none of this required any effort on his part. Shurashev was different from the hyperthymic individuals described in Box 3.6 in that his memory abilities were not limited to episodic events, but like Jill Price, The cost of maintaining all of these details in cognitive store was enormous. Try as he might, Shuroshevsky could not forget information, and he complained that his mind often felt like a cluttered junk box. Perhaps because of this, he had difficulty using retrieved memories and other cognitive processes. For example, he claimed to have problems recognizing people because their faces were constantly changing. He had vivid mental images of facial details, but most people do not look exactly the same at every encounter, particularly if considerable time has passed between meetings. Shuroshevsky also had problems extrapolating from the specific to the general, understanding that dogs could all belong to the same species, despite their overt differences. In a similar way, he could understand the literal, but not the abstract, meaning of a text. Luria, 1968, provides a detailed and very sympathetic account of Shuroshevsky's cognitive abilities, as well as the emotional and personal challenges he faced. Similar profiles are presented in clinical reports by the contemporary author and neurologist Oliver Sacks, and in the film Rain Man, which is loosely based on the life of Lawrence Kim Peek, 1951 to 2009. The striking point in all of these portrayals is that an extraordinary memory for detail, with a limited ability to generalize beyond these, is frequently associated with poor social and cognitive adjustment. Despite the obvious advantages of categorization, this cognitive process comes at a cost. For one thing, the speed and ease with which new information is categorized may lead to incorrect classification or a failure to update the criteria which define a category. In other words, individuals who make quick category decisions based on minimal information may overlook unique and defining features of items within a category. This is reminiscent of perceptual rules of thumb, discussed in Chapter 2, a cognitive strategy that allows organisms to make cost-effective decisions sometimes results in inappropriate response to or judgments about individual stimuli. The same is true of categorization. Stereotypes are a prime example. People often make snap judgments about others based on their sex, ethnicity, or religious displays. The outcome can range from personal insult to widespread bloodshed. As deplorable or maladaptive as these responses may seem, they are offset by the advantages, including a reduced need for computational processing, that come with categorization. Finally, the evolutionary advantages of categorizing stimuli are magnified when cognitive processing extends to concept formation. A mental representation of a concept, which includes group attributes, provides information about stimuli or events that are not immediately apparent. This allows individuals to predict non-evident from evident properties and to make judgments about events in their environment. As the preceding discussion indicates, categorization facilitates decision-making, as well as many other cognitive processes that are discussed throughout this book. Some researchers argue that the ability to extend abstract rules about group membership to new situations is a fundamental component only of human cognition. As expected, not everyone agrees, and the debate is far from settled.